Alrighty, this is Grace with the Authentic Voice podcast, and I am delighted to introduce Ms. Brittney-Nicole Connor-Sarvada today, who is a self-proclaimed recovering miserable person who now helps parents to break the cycle of toxic social norms and generational trauma. Welcome, Brittney.
It is such a pleasure. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, Grace. Thanks for having me.
Of course, pleasure is all mine. And I can't wait to jump into these topics with you. If you could just tell us a little bit about what first interested you in generational trauma and toxic behaviors within the family setting.
It has been a journey. And I think anybody who is on that healing path, you don't really realize how you got to where you are until you turn around and see how everything kind of connected. But long story short, I'm an only child, only grandchild on my dad's side. And I thought I had fairly normal childhood, right? There were some elements of my childhood that I always knew were a little bit different. But for the most part, I just thought this is just normal. It's normal to have anxiety. It's normal for, parents to behave in certain ways. And then as you get older and you start to see how that impacts your life, for me at least, I started to question, was this normal? Is this normal?
Mm.
Just because it's the norm in our society to have anxiety, to question ourselves, to have low self-esteem, to become hypercritical either of yourself or others. Yeah, that may be normal in our society, but is it normal really for us as our essence of being, so to speak? And those questions really didn't come about until years later, right? For me, it just started with realizing I'm miserable. I'm angry. I am always seeking control of my environment, of people. And when things don't go my way, I don't know how to cope. I don't know how to handle it. And so I was just a very explosive teenager, young adult. And it was really interesting because a lot of people hearing my story now that knew me in high school, they were like, I would have never have guessed that because I was such a quiet, reserved
Mm.
person. It was only the people that were closest to me that really got to see those toxic behaviors in me. And for the longest time, I blamed everyone around me for why I was the way that I was. And I think it was around age 15, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, later OCD, then ADD. And I just thought, well, this is just, of course I have all these things. It runs in the family. Pretty much everybody in my family had some type of anxiety disorder, depression, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic behaviors. And so I was like, well, I mean, it just runs in the family. But then it wasn't until later that I started to ask, well, why does it run in the family? Is this really a genetic chemical disorder? Or is this just a, generational inherited unhealed trauma, kind of response, right? And so that's kind of where I am now, realizing after doing 11, 12 years of self-discovery and self-healing that I've been able to reverse all of my clinical diagnoses because I am working to heal the wounds of my family, and not just family, because generational trauma encompasses far more than just family. It's social norms, cultural norms, all of these things that are being passed down generation after generation holistically in every aspect. And the reason that I've kind of switched, for the longest time I worked with individuals, but being an expecting mom, so as we're recording this, I'm 29 weeks. And a lot of things have come to light as an expecting mom, like how to set boundaries with my family that still have unhealed wounds, how to communicate effectively to them and not, trigger them when it comes to how are we going to, and I say co-parenting in the sense of being a parent and being a grandparent. Like I want them to be a part of my child's life, but I also don't want those toxic behaviors that I experienced to be passed down to my child, right? And so these conversations that I thought I would never have to have with my parents, now I'm having to have. And so that opens a whole new door to what it means to heal from generational trauma. So that's one element, right? How do we cope with that as an expecting parent dealing with our family if we want to have those close relationships? How do we ensure, especially if we're expecting mothers because we are carrying the child, like what role does epigenetics play in that? If I still have unaddressed wounds, that means if I'm experiencing anxiety, depression while I'm carrying my child, those chemicals are being passed through the placenta to the child, which is predisposing them for anxiety disorder or depression. And that doesn't mean that we can't fix that, right? As they grow up, but there's just it's very complex. There's all these nuances and there's all these stages to understanding how we heal and how we break the cycle for the next generation. So that is a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think that covered all bases if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, thank you for that answer. That's so insightful. And I feel like you and I have a very similar background story to where I grew up in a house where I was a very quiet, reserved child. And from the outside, I probably looked very happy and healthy. But I became an extremely, shall we say, prickly young
Mm.
lady in my teens and my 20s, just really, really anxious, lots of emotional ups and downs, lots of self-doubt. Um, and I feel like most people just kind of wake up in their mid 30s and go, what the fuck is going on with my life right now? Why am I so miserable? And so I also, like you, kind of woke up to being miserable one day and realized I need to address this. And this is something that I've been carrying around for my entire life.
Yeah.
So Brittany, you now work specifically with parents who are kind of entangled in generational trauma. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, are those parents carrying wounds from prior generations, from their parents, or maybe even grandparents? And then if they are parents, all the feelings that they're experiencing around trying to create a better reality for their children as they become aware of all those things.
Yeah. It's so multifaceted, right? Because we don't know where it really began. We don't know where it's really going to end. I think all of us are going to pass something down, whether we want to or not. And I always tell parents, don't feel shame or guilt if you feel like you've already done damage. Because I tend to work with younger parents. And when I say younger, I'm not talking about their age, I'm talking about the age of their children. So 0 to 5, because 0 to 7 are the what they call critical years of development. And only because not that it hardwires your child to be who they're going to be forever, but it's the easiest time to make those changes and to set up a better mindset and view of self and the external world, right? Doesn't mean it's impossible at any time. So I don't want any parents to feel guilty for like, oh my gosh, I have a 20-year-old or I have like a 13-year-old and I feel like I've already done this damage. Because one thing that I always tell people, if it wasn't for my childhood, I would not be where I am today. And who knows if I would be as self-aware as, I would have if I didn't have all those traumatic experiences. So I'm the kind of person who, I haven't always felt this way, but through experiences, I do believe that everything happens for a reason. And I don't expect everybody to buy into that. That's totally fine. But I'm very grateful for every experience that I've had in my life. And then, yes, I do focus on familial, I guess, trauma. Um, but I think society, we don't take a really deep look at how society impacts us on a very, very grand scale. I think the social structures and norms that we are indoctrinated into play a heavy role in creating family trauma, right? Because if society says, this is what it looks like to be successful, this is what you need to feel worthy about yourself, then that creates feelings of self-doubt, which can lead to the symptoms of anger in some people, depression in others. And then that anger and depression, our children may become an outlet for that anger or depression. So again, I think it's extremely complex. So I start with addressing the symptoms. Like, how are you exhibiting these unhealed emotional wounds? Is it giving the silent treatment? Are you more of a neglectful parent where when you're stressed, you shut yourself off from the rest of the world and you're not giving your best to your children? Or maybe you're hyper hands-on. Maybe you're a helicopter parent where you just need so much control and then that's pushing your child away, which is exhibiting all these other symptoms. So it's it varies so much from parent to parent and also the personality of that child. Two parents could exhibit the exact same behavior, but based on the personality of their child, it's received very differently.
Hmm.
So there's so many, it's very complex.
That's so interesting. And it, like you said, it is so multifaceted,
Yes.
um, of kind of addressing all of these different angles of, did that person have a depressed mother and receive, depressive, anxious chemicals in their body while they were in the womb? How does that affect someone? And then the piece of, what grandparents are passing down to parents who are passing down to their children, that piece of just behaviors and very subtle patterns of neglect and abuse that most people really don't uncover until they're, adults, much, much later on in life.
Yeah. And I think, you see this a lot with going from grandparents to parents to the children. What often happens is, let's say the grandparents were hyper controlling. So the parents are aware that they do not want to be hyper controlling, like the grandparents, their parents, right? So then they're a little bit more lax, maybe too lax with their children. So the pendulum swings a little bit too far. They're trying to overcorrect. And then you end up creating kids that may be entitled, right? And
Mhm.
so we have to be careful with overcorrection because we can create something that's just as problematic, but from the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's so interesting. And I think, as somebody who has cut ties with my own parents, right, which is an extreme case when you become estranged, um, working really hard subconsciously to say, I'm never going to be like that. And then, like you said, sometimes that swings the pendulum too far to the other side, to the other extreme. So how do you advise people on kind of untangling their perspective and their perception of their values versus the values that they were raised with?
Mm. So I always ask parents, what do you want for your child and what do you not want for your child? I think that's a good place to start because I feel like most parents know what they want and what they don't want. They don't always know the motivation behind those wants, and they don't always know how to facilitate the outcome of those wants. So if we can get clear on what we want and what we don't want, then we ask ourselves, where is this coming from? Is this a scarcity mindset? Is this an overcorrective thing? Is this coming from a deep, uh, grounded awareness where you really understand why you want these things? Is it societal pressure that is creating these desires for what you want? Is it the pressure from the outside world? So we kind of unpack all of that. And then we say, okay, what is it going to take? And this is kind of where I help them from my background in psychology and emotional intelligence and self healing and all of that. And we create a blueprint for what does that look like? How do we facilitate this? Creating that balance so we're not overcorrecting and doing it in a way that offers flexibility to the child. Because sometimes we think, well, in order to get this result, I have to do this very specific thing, right? Now we're setting too strict of boundaries to where we can create that rebellious behavior or that resistance, right? So, how do we create that freedom for that child while also still facilitating that?
Mm.
And then the third thing is asking, okay, how are my unhealed wounds going to inhibit being able to facilitate that? That is extremely critical
Wow.
because I think we all know like the quote unquote right things to do in some instances, but it can be extremely challenging to do those things if we haven't healed ourselves. So then we start to unpack that. So everything is layers. Everything is layers, but it starts with awareness.
That is so insightful, and it really leads into my next question. I'm sure you see this all the time, and I have a lot of friends who are in this situation where they've woken up, they realize that they have some family trauma, some childhood stuff that's unprocessed. And they are working on themselves, maybe going to therapy, trying to process their unprocessed wounds that they've never dealt with, that they've never unpacked. Um, and also trying to be parents at the same time, right? So if you could speak a little bit to what it takes to hold space for their own inner child and also be a parent at the same time.
I think communication and vulnerability is critical. I believe that as parents, we feel obligated to be the strong person, to not show weakness, to always have the answer, because that was kind of the way it was communicated to us, right? And that if we're not that strong, resilient, always have the answer person, then we're not a good parent and we're putting a burden on our children. And I disagree with that. I'm not saying that you should use your child as a shoulder to cry on, but I do think that it's important to communicate our own challenges and show that we may be their parents, but we are also human and we make mistakes and we're not always going to get it right. and we struggle with emotions too, right? And healing while being a parent, for me, like, again, I'm not a parent yet, but
You
I
are
also
technically.
well, you know, I'm not having to have these conversations yet, but I will say that I have had these conversations in relationships. And I think it's the same way whenever you're parenting. In a relationship, because that is what a parent-child thing is, it's a relationship, right? Um, in relationships, we always want to put our best foot forward, and we want to have others perceive us in our best light all the time, which we're human. That's just not reality. And so what happens is we may have a bad day, right? And so our tolerance for self-regulating our emotions is extremely low. But we tell ourselves, I can't show this side of myself to anybody, right? I have to keep my emotions under check. And so we do our best to keep it together. I'm going to stay calm. I'm going to stay calm. I'm going to stay calm. And guess what happens? What happens? If we're low on energy, we blow up, we react, we respond, and then to that person or to our child, it seems to be coming out of the blue. And it almost seems as if they were the trigger for that, right? When it could have just been, we had a really bad day at work, or maybe we're just really depressed today for whatever reason. We're just having a crummy day. And so all it takes is them screaming a little bit too loud when they're playing, or asking you the same question over and over again when you've said, I can't
Are we
right now,
there yet? Are
right?
we there yet?
Yeah. So in this sense, if I already know that I'm running low on energy, instead of saying, I'm going to keep calm, I'm going to keep calm, I'm going to keep calm, I immediately disclose how I'm feeling. I come home, give it, obviously hypothetical for me, right? Come home, give the kid a hug and say, hey, mommy is really tired today and she's really struggling with with her emotions right now. So she's very hypersensitive. I'm very hypersensitive to loud noises. So could you help mommy out and just be a little bit more quieter today? I would really appreciate that, because I don't want to react and you feel like it's your fault. Okay, so mommy may be a little bit to herself today. Can you please be understanding of that? So, what you're modeling for your child is honesty, compassion for yourself and others, effective communication, vulnerability, like all of these boundary setting, healthy boundary setting, and showing that we're all struggling sometimes with our feelings. And this is how to effectively express it instead of just reacting.
Oh man, that's so good. Um, I really feel like there were times growing up when I kind of internalized my parents' behavior because they didn't communicate their feelings. And it's like, if you're already like a quiet, introverted kid, or even if you're not, like kids read the room, they read people's faces and they hear voice and tone just like we do,
Yes.
right? And we
Yes.
internalize those things. And so that's so important what you're saying about just starting the conversation with, hey, this is how I'm feeling. Like, I am not feeling great. And can you turn the TV down? And can you go play in the other room? That just is such a game changer. So that's a really great tip for people to implement that.
Yeah. Yeah. And letting the kid know, like, you've done nothing wrong, right? If I'm a little grouchy, just know it's not you. And if I say anything that hurts your feelings, please let me know. And that can be really hard for us to hear when we're on our healing journey, because we still don't necessarily have that compassion for ourselves. And so it may sting and it may burn quite a bit when a child or even a significant other says, you know, that really hurt my feelings, or the way you acted just was extremely nasty, right? Or you're a mean mommy, or you're a mean daddy, right? Because those labels we affix to our identity instead of seeing what I said came across harsh. What I said wasn't very nice, but it has nothing to do with who I am as a person,
Yeah.
right?
Wow. And another question I'm dying to ask you is, um, when parents are doing this healing work on themselves and they are already aware of some past trauma in their family, and they're on that healing journey, um, as they're doing the work, I think they become aware of wanting to instill those skills in their kids, right? Of like starting to train the next generation to be emotionally intelligent and to like check in with their feelings. Like, can you speak to that a little bit?
This is a really tricky place, because it's kind of that monkey see, monkey do, right? Children do as they see, not as they're told. And it's it's very ironic. It's kind of a paradox because until we are fully healed, if you even can say that, right? Until we are significantly along on our healing journey, we're going to be messing up a lot. And so how do we instill that in our children when we may not always be exhibiting that behavior? And I think this is where open communication comes in again, and humbling ourselves and allowing our children to be our teachers. And what I mean by that is, if we say, like, here's how we can identify our emotions, or here's how we can regulate our emotions. If we're teaching that to our children, and then maybe our child says, hey, mommy, hey, daddy, you need to go to the quiet corner and da 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 da.
You're dysregulated, mom.
Yeah, as a parent, that may like catch us off guard and say, I'm the parent here, right? We go right back to that generational script of, I'm the parent, you're the child. You don't tell me what to do, right? So we have to be very conscious. If this is the behavior we want to display for them and we teach them this, they need to be able to call us out when we're not behaving appropriately. And then, while we may not have modeled the appropriate behavior initially, we can model the humility and the awareness to catch ourselves when we're called out, so that they're seeing that when we're called out on our mistakes, it's good to recognize that and be that humble person, say, oh, you're right. I am acting this way. Maybe I do need to go to the calm down corner,
Wow.
right? And being that model for them in that sense. You're right. I am. And then following through with what you're teaching them.
So that's a really great answer. So what I'm hearing you say is, at the core of kind of dancing the dance of like doing your own self-healing as a parent, but then also instilling emotional regulation skills in the kids, at the core of that is like modeling and leading by example, right? So like,
100%.
yeah.
100%. Yeah.
So those behaviors just speak so loud and clear, and then you can reinforce it with language, but language alone isn't enough, right?
Yeah. I think figuring it out together, like, it's such a beautiful thing. I know people, again, in relationships, because I've worked in the past more so with individuals and people in relationships, seeing partners recover and go through this together, and just the humility of it all and the acceptance. I think that's what's sorely lacking right now is a lack of acceptance, either for ourselves or for others. We are so conditioned to be conditional.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Love, as we've come to know it, is not pure love. It's conditional love. You know, if you yell at me, then you must not love me. If you don't do XYZ exactly the way that I want it done, then you do not love me. And I think being able to see the imperfections within each other and to accept those imperfections of ourselves and the other person is just, I think that's really a huge step in the healing process.
Wow. Yeah. And I know another situation that I wanted to talk with you about is um, in my Facebook community where we all kind of gather to talk about these topics. Um, a lot of people struggle with, going over to grandma's house for her birthday or the holidays and just kind of trying to figure out like how to set healthy boundaries when like maybe all three generations are together in a room. And so many people say, oh, my mom like always does this thing and it's going to be awful. But then they, have to like put on a mask and like,
Mm.
be happy go lucky for the kids, but also want to protect the kids against like any kind of like verbal or emotional digs or abuse or neglect. And it feels sometimes like, people just feel like they're walking around on eggshells trying to balance those things. So I'd love for
Yeah.
you to speak to that.
I have definitely been there. Um, the first thing I tell people is you are not responsible for other people's emotions. You are responsible for your expression of your emotions. Because I think we can often misinterpret what that means, right? And we can use that, well, I'm not responsible for how you feel, and just kind of say whatever we want, saying, well, too bad, like, that's on you, right? And that's not what I mean by that. What I mean by that is I am fully responsible for the emotional energy I put out into the world. I am fully responsible for the energy that I absorb from other people. And it is not my job to heal, fix, correct anyone else. I think that is the first step, is that realization of knowing our place and knowing the other person's place. And realizing that nobody can hurt our feelings. Now, that a lot of people struggle to understand that. But the truth of the matter is, we have to accept what they are saying in order to feel that response, that emotional response. So that just shows that if we are emotionally triggered by what someone says, that we have wounds that have not been healed, and we are accepting what they are saying as fact. We are allowing it to become our truth. So whenever I deal with family, a lot of the snarky remarks, a lot of the nasty comments, I just realized that this is their unhealed wounds. Either they need control in their life, they need something that they are trying to get either a reaction out of me, they're trying to control me in some way. Am I going to allow that? Now we can do one of two things. We can get emotionally involved in that and react, right? And show them, prove to them, you're not going to have that control over me. But if we feel like we have to prove something, then we are just as reactive as they are because we have something to prove.
Oh,
If
that's
you
such
have
a good
nothing
point.
to prove, then you can disconnect from that, set your boundaries, and regardless of how they respond, because I think so many people think, and I thought this for the longest time, if I say it in the right way, then it'll get them to stop acting this way, or they'll get it, it'll sink in. No, you cannot control. I've had so many encounters after I have healed and I have been super calm. It doesn't matter if that person is in a victim mentality, if they're on a lower energy frequency than you, it does not matter how you say it, what you say, how loving you are, how calm you are. They are going to react from the state that they are currently at. So reiterating it multiple times is a waste of your energy. So I just recommend going in without expectations, because expectations are an attachment, and attachment is the root of suffering, right? So if I go in knowing that their behavior may look like XYZ and I accept that, but I also accept where I draw the line and know logically, okay, if they say this is how I'm going to react, but I'm not going to get emotionally involved. Because as soon as you get emotionally involved, now you're both reacting from one another. You say your piece with love and compassion. And I know that's hard for people to do and hard for them to understand. And when I say love and compassion, I'm not saying you say it in a way that seems loving, because you can see right through that, right? It's like you try to be the bigger person. Trying to be the bigger person is getting involved in the ego.
You're still trying to prove something.
You're still trying to prove something. Exactly. Exactly. So it's really about coming from a place of they have emotional wounds and I am being triggered by these emotional wounds. How do I want to react? Like being purely logical, saying it as a matter of fact. And if it gets to the point where you don't feel like that's a safe environment to be in, or you don't want to expose your children or yourself to that, say, look, I would love for us to have a great holiday together. I would love for us to be able to come over and visit. But until I feel like we can be respectful of one another, and when I say respectful, this is what this looks like to me, then I think we need to take some time away. And if you want to have a conversation about it, we can. But right now, I can't be around this for XYZ reason. When you say this is how I feel. When you do this is how I want to respond. And I don't want to have those emotions, and I don't want to be reactive. And I don't want my child exposed to that. And if they blow up at you, don't come back at them. You've already said your piece. Because at that point, they're looking for a reaction.
Mhm.
It's not easy to detach, but
Yeah, that's such a tricky situation to be in. And you and I kind of both have personal experience with that. And I love what you said about um, taking radical responsibility for the energy that you're bringing to the situation, and knowing that, being aware of that, what kind of energy am I bringing into this room? And then what kind of energy am I willing and not willing to take on and to absorb, right? And taking
yes.
responsibility of like what we're internalizing, and what we are reacting to.
And here's another thing, and this can be extremely challenging, and it's something that I still struggle with today. But going into a new experience as a new experience, we often go into an experience carrying the baggage of prior experiences and maybe the resentment that we've held on to from those prior experiences. I know in my family, one person in particular, they will never say anything about something bothering them. In fact, you'll never even know that something bothered them. And then as soon as you bring something to their attention, maybe something they said to you that hurt your feelings, they have this arsenal stockpiled of all the times that you've said or done or whatever to hurt their feelings. Now, that's a straight defense mode, right? Because they don't want to take ownership or responsibility for what you're trying to address with them. So they've stockpiled all these things. They've never brought them up to you before. And now they're unloading them, which is completely irrelevant to that moment in time. So I always recommend if you didn't address it in the moment, then hold your peace and let it go. If something bothers you, bring it up then and there. Otherwise, you're going to mull over it. It's going to turn into something that it really probably wasn't, because our memory is very, very faulty, and our memory is more encoded with emotion versus objective reality. So the longer you sit on that, the more that you're going to exacerbate that feeling and how it actually happened. So if someone else, so that's your responsibility, right? Like, address it as it comes about and don't sit on it. Now, that doesn't say if you need to take like an hour or a day to let your emotions settle before you address it, that's fine. But what I'm saying is, don't let a week go by, don't let a month go by before you address it. And then the second part of that is, if you find someone using their stockpile of emotion or things that have happened against you, say, look, that was then. It should have been brought to my attention then. This is the first time I'm hearing of it. It's not relevant now. So while I'm sorry that happened, you didn't bring it to my attention, so I can't do anything to correct for that. What I am talking about is right here, right now. And if we can't talk about right here, right now, then we don't need to be having this conversation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I totally see both sides of that too, because, um, you know, people who have, kind of ostrich parents who stick their head in the sand and are just kind of like, I'm not here, I'm not here, parents who just do not want to talk about their emotions and have an emotional relationship with their children. Sometimes it's very difficult for that child, small or grown, to then begin a relationship and a communication channel of expressing their emotional status and what they're experiencing. And I also very much respect and appreciate what you're saying about, it's on you to tell the rest of the world how you're feeling. Like, if something hurt your feelings, like, don't dive bomb your friend like 3 months later with this like emotional artillery of like, well, you ghosted me that time, like back in December or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So,
questions are great too. And non-attacking questions, right? I'm trying to think of some examples, but if they bring up all this stuff, just saying, I'm just curious why you're bringing this up now. Instead of saying, well, why is this the first time I'm hearing of it? It sounds like you're saying the same thing, right, through that question, but it comes across very differently. Like, why is this the first time I'm hearing of it? Instead of saying, I'm really curious as to why you're bringing that up now when we're talking about this.
yeah.
And being quiet. We love to fill space with chatter. Allow the person to think instead of like finding a moment of silence, like, oh, well, they don't know the answer, so let me like throw something else at them. Just be quiet. Be conscious of how you're feeling towards them. Because again, as soon as that, like, I'm trying to prove something, I'm the better person here, you're falling to their level, and it's going to be confrontational. And while the other person may not seem receptive to you at that time, because it's natural to be defensive or on the offense, right? So we have to ensure that we have that compassionate understanding, because while they may come back with how nasty we are and this, that, and the other, that's just the ego trying to defend itself. And to me, what that signals is I've struck a truth that they're not willing to accept.
Mm.
And by holding that space for them, by not saying, yeah, I told you so, or coming back at them, you are allowing that to sit into their subconscious. And it may take months, it may take years for them to act on that, but they will not forget that. And I also say that from a firsthand experience of when I was a very angry, nasty, hateful person, there were things said to me by very compassionate people that I jumped down their throats as soon as they said it. But boy, did that strike a chord with me and start the wheels turning. And I come back to that years later as that was a pivotal moment of awareness for me. And I'm so grateful for them. So don't be fooled by people's reactions to you. Just know that if you're coming at it from love, you can't go wrong. You just can't.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I think what you're saying about be quiet is so simple and it's so undervalued at the same time, especially like if someone is dealing with a parent that's very aggressive or confrontational or kind of attacking, like likes to get under your skin. I think just being quiet and letting them sit with more of like what they're putting out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's almost like counter reacting by under reacting,
It's like
instead of,
holding a mirror up. It, it
yeah,
it gives it time to reverberate, right? If
and
you jump in and start saying something, it's like an echo, right? Allow it to get back to them and really think about what you're about to say next. And then, maybe follow up with a question, or maybe you don't even need to say anything, right? Silence, silence talks. It really does.
well, Brittany, I am so thankful for all of your insight and wisdom and you sharing all of these experiences with us today on the Authentic Voice podcast. You
My
can
pleasure.
You can learn more about Brittany at generational-trauma.com and learn about the coaching work and her blog and all of the writing and speaking that she does around this topic of generational trauma and parents who are trying to be better parents than their parents were. Thank you so
Thank you
much,
so much,
Brittany.
Grace. It's a pleasure.